Hi, listeners. This is the 80,000 Hours podcast, where each week we have an unusually in-depth conversation about one of the world's most pressing problems and how you can use your career to solve it. I'm Rob Wiblin, Director of Research at 80,000 Hours. Today, I'm speaking with Professor Cass Sunstein. Cass is a professor at Harvard Law School who focuses on constitutional law, administrative law, and behavioral economics. He was put in charge of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the Obama administration's first term, and studies of legal publications between 2009 and 2013 found Sunstein to be the most frequently cited American legal scholar by a wide margin. Many listeners will be familiar with his book, co-authored with Richard Thaler, called Nudge: Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, which laid out the case for libertarian paternalism. But folks might not know that he was also a pioneering author on animal welfare law, writing Standing for Animals in 1999, The Rights of Animals, a very short primer in 2002, and co-authoring Animal Rights, Current Debates and New Directions with philosopher Martha Nussbaum in 2004. He's also been an active promoter of cost-benefit analysis in government and the law, writing The Cost-Benefit State in 1996, and recently publishing The Cost-Benefit Revolution last year. Finally, he's also taken an interest in existential risks, in 2007 releasing Worst Case Scenarios, an attempt to explain how society should avoid both under- and overreacting to the most severe threats that we face. Today, though, we're speaking about his new book, How Change Happens, a study of how social cascades can change our culture overnight, and how this can be used for good and ill. The book ties together a number of important concepts that psychologists have been developing over the last few decades. And the first 50 pages seem like really important reading for any activist or politician who's trying to build support for their ideas. Professor Sunstein is an incredibly busy guy, so I was only able to get an hour with him. And to avoid wasting time having him repeat the basic thesis of the book, which he's done plenty of times already, Kieran put together an abridged version of a lecture that Cass gave at the Harvard Law School Library back in April, which outlines all of his key points. Thanks to Harvard College for allowing us to use that presentation. It lasts 38 minutes, and we've put it right at the start, which means once Cass and I start talking, we can dive straight into questioning how accurate his model is and what implications it has for people who want to have a positive social impact. We'll get to that in just one second, but first I wanted to let you know that we recently released our 2018 annual review, which outlines what we ourselves at 80,000 Hours worked on last year, and how much impact we think we had. We'll link to that in the blog post and the show notes for the episode. We still have a bit to go to close all of our funding needs for this and next year. So if you also feel passionate about 80,000 Hours' mission of solving the world's most pressing problems and would like to support our work, the show notes will include a link where you can find out how to donate. All right, without further ado, here's 38 minutes of Cass explaining how change happens, followed by our conversation about the book.
Okay, so the title I wanted to give for this book was Why Societies Go Whoosh, W-H-O-O-S-H, but the publisher said no, that would be too obscure and undignified. This is also 25 years in the making. So a long, long time ago, I did a first draft of what is now Chapter 3, which is about how law changes social norms. But I kind of got stuck for the 1990s and the 2000s, got a little distracted. And this basically emerged recently. And I'll tell you a bit of research that helped orient its emergence. In Saudi Arabia, there's a custom that wives don't work unless husbands say it's okay. That's the custom. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority of young Saudi men think it's fine if their wives work. It's also the case that Saudi men overwhelmingly believe that other Saudi men think it's unacceptable if their wives work. So the private view of young Saudi men is it's fine. Maybe it's good. The perception of young Saudi men is that people like them think it's not good and not fine. There's an opportunity there. So in the relevant research, the experimenters told young Saudi men that actually guys like you think it's fine if wives are working outside of the home. Guess what happened? As a result, the number of Saudi women applying for jobs in the relevant group increased dramatically 4 months later. Okay, I'm going to be using that as a clue to the answer to the question about how change happens. What I want to give some particular attention to is why change often seems to come out of nowhere. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, completely unanticipated. The fact that Brexit worked, not completely unanticipated, and it hasn't quite worked yet, but the fact that it succeeded was widely not expected. The rise of feminism in various parts of the world at different moments in history came as a shock to many people who embraced feminism. The rise of fascism in the 1930s, including the success of Hitler and Mussolini, who knew that could happen? We're in the midst of an assortment of social movements. Some of them we can glimpse, some are barely on the horizon. And one thing that's highly likely is that the best prognosticators today are going to get it wrong. I'm going to start with some pretty simple remarks about why the unexpected nature of social success, including transformative success, is not as baffling as it appears to be. And I'm going to apply this to #MeToo on the ground that it's of interest in itself, and #MeToo tells us something more general about social change in numerous fields. So here's a way to get clear on the mystery that motivates the obsession I've had. Tocqueville, probably the greatest sociologist ever, at least one of the candidates. If they gave an all-time greatest sociologist award, Tocqueville would be on the short list. He reported that no one foresaw the French Revolution. Nobody. Lenin was stunned by the speed and success of the Russian Revolution. Lenin. If anyone was an architect, it was Lenin. He had no idea. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was unanticipated, including by the participants. The idea that the country could turn round, as Iran did, that was not expected. The Arab Spring was unanticipated by the best analysts in the United Kingdom and the United States. I saw this up close because I was in the White House at the time. And when things happened in the Arab Spring, the leading experts were amazed. They didn't see it coming. Okay, it's common in social science circles to refer to two things, demonstration effects and contagion effects. But that might be like trying to explain the success of opium by its dormitive qualities. Opium induces sleep. Opium is said by some pranksters to induce sleep because it has dormitive properties. That's not an explanation. That's a restatement. To say that the success of social movements is a product of demonstration and contagion effects is like an explanation by noun rather than an explanation of a phenomenon. It doesn't tell you anything. Okay, I'm going to try to make progress by referring to three things: preference falsification, diverse thresholds, and interdependencies. Elaboration will come, but for starters, everyone on the planet, including everyone in this room, has some desires and beliefs and experiences in our heads that we have told either no one or only our closest family and friends. The fact is that we will silence ourselves about some of the things we want. It may involve Harvard, it may involve Massachusetts, it may involve the United Nations, it may involve the United States. We shut up. Or worse, we misstate what we actually think. That's preference falsification. The second point involving diverse thresholds is that for some people, and you know them, don't you? Injustice, and they're there. I had a friend in the Middle East a number of years ago where we witnessed, he and I, a father beating up a child. It was probably his child. And it was on the street, and he was just punching him. And my friend, who was Irish and had a temper and about 5'7", he just ran up to that guy and said, "Stop hitting that child." Now that was a low threshold. He didn't need anyone to support him before he did that. He was there, I followed him and supported him, but he had a low threshold. I had a slightly higher threshold. Some people with respect to injustice have very high thresholds. With respect to the third part, interdependencies, most of us are really reactive to what other people say and do. If one person is doing something, embracing, let's say, a Green New Deal or calling for animal rights, we might think, crazy person. But if 1,000 are embracing an idea or a movement, we might think, why haven't I joined them already? If you put together preference falsification, diverse thresholds, and interdependencies, the difficulty of anticipating social change and even large-scale social transformations becomes much less puzzling. Now what I'm going to do, I've told you the text, and like any self-respecting law professor, the text is much shorter than the footnotes. And here come the footnotes. Ready? They're not going to be in small font. Footnote 1, with respect to preference falsification, people might say they like an existing status quo when they really don't, or they might change the subject when a status quo is raised, or they might hear a little voice in their head which they turn off. Here are some words from the best book I've ever read on Nazism. And it's the best book because it's not only revealing, it's also cheerful. So you can read it without crying. And it's written by a journalist who went back to Germany in the 1950s and spoke to former Nazis and found, to his at least mild surprise, he liked everyone. They were all good people. One of them said this when asked about opposition. The former Nazi named Karl said, "Opposition? How would anybody know? How would anybody know what somebody else opposes or doesn't oppose? That a man says he opposes or doesn't oppose depends on the circumstances, where and when, and to whom, and just how he says it. And even then, you must still guess why he says what he says." Now, that's offhand remarks by someone who wasn't a social theorist, but who lived under Nazism. And it's profound. He's suggesting that the existence or absence of opposition is contingent on what's permissible, what social norms are. To that extent, Karl is referring to the fact that in Germany, as in every society, people live in a state of pluralistic ignorance, which means we don't know what is in other people's heads. People might seem content with the status quo or miserable about it, when in fact what they're thinking inside, if you could see a thought bubble, would be very different. And if they're silent, it's very hard to know what they're thinking. The law matters if people lack freedom of speech and if dissent is punished, but social norms are often the villain of the piece, if there's a villain, in the sense that they mean that people might be ostracized or shunned or punished in some way if they say what they really think. I gave you some words from the 1950s. Here are some words from basically yesterday, from Syria. When you meet somebody coming out of Syria for the first time, you start to hear the same sentences, that everything is okay in Syria. Syria is a great country. The economy is doing great. It'll take him like 6 months, up to 1 year, to become a normal human being, to say what he thinks, what he feels. Then they might start whispering. They won't speak loudly. That is too scary. After all that time, even outside Syria, you feel that someone is listening, someone is recording. Okay, the Syrian computer programmer in that case is the same as the former Nazi, is the same as the young Syrian men who were saying something even to their spouses, which is different from what was actually inside their minds. Second moving part is diverse threshold. Some people require no support at all before they will say what they think or join a movement. They might be courageous, foolhardy, or just deeply committed. We can call them, and this isn't pejorative, the zeros, in the sense that they need nothing to join a movement of one or another kind. It could be white nationalism, it could be Nazism, it could be a liberation movement. If no one joins them, they are going to be marginalized. They'll look foolhardy, extreme, or possibly nuts. That's the technical term. MIT Press didn't let me put that in the book. Other people are going to require some social support. Like me in the Middle Eastern country, I supported my friend, but I needed him to go first. People like this won't move unless someone else does, but if someone else does, they're prepared to join too. Call them the ones. Others require more than a little. They need two people, so they are the twos. The twos are followed by people who, not shockingly, have numbers assigned to them, all the way up to hundreds and thousands, including, eventually, the infinites, defined as people who, for one or another reason, won't challenge the status quo, no matter what. Okay, here's the kicker. It's extremely difficult to observe people's internal preferences in light of preference falsification. It's even harder to get at people's thresholds, and we ourselves probably don't know what our thresholds are. In the Iranian Revolution, people who participated in the revolt were amazed that they did. Some of them turned out to be 4s and they had no idea. Others turned out to be 70s, and they might have thought that they were infinites. Consider the astonished words. Now we're talking actually about a large part of the dynamics of the American Revolution. John Adams wrote with amazement, "Idolatry to monarchs and servility to aristocratical pride was never so totally eradicated from so many minds in so short a time." I have a friendly amendment to Adams. I don't think he has it quite right. It's not as if there was idolatry and servility eradicated. It's that people who were silent about their resentment and distress weren't silent anymore. So it seemed like a ratification. It was instead a kind of unleashing. Thomas Paine put it, I think, more precisely. He said, "Our style and manner of thinking have undergone a revolution more extraordinary than the political revolution of a country." Now, for Paine to say that in the midst of the American Revolution, that's drama. More extraordinary is what's happened to our manner of thinking. We see with other eyes, we hear with other ears, and think with other thoughts than those we formerly used. I think Paine is also speaking of preference falsification undone. His language doesn't quite get at that, but any reading of the American Revolution shows that's what's happening. Preference falsification and diverse thresholds are turning in a direction of movement because the zeros and the ones and the twos started to act. Okay, last moving part is interdependencies. Everything depends on who is seen to have done what and exactly when. So diverse thresholds are one thing. Whether people are going to move depends on whether the zeros go first and are seen to have told that father to stop hitting his kid, whether the ones are seen to have joined a movement, let's say for #MeToo, and then the twos and the threes and the fours. And if that's what happens, we're going to see a movement and it's going to succeed. But everything depends on the distribution of action and the thresholds. If there are no zeros, or if no one sees any of them, no rebellion's going to occur. If there are few ones, the status quo is going to be safe. If most people are tens or hundreds or thousands, the same is true, even if there are plenty of 2s and 3s and 4s. Okay, those are my 3 moving parts. I have to add one fourth component, which helps explain why social inflammation sometimes occurs. And that is rooted in what I learned from a failed academic project from a few years ago. The failed academic project was a group decision-making, and in our work, we found how outraged individuals are about corporate wrongdoing. And in trying to study jury behavior, we put individuals into computer-generated juries. We had a bunch of jurors. We created statistical juries, and we took the median judgment of the statistical juries as the likely predictor of what the jury would do. Critics of our paper, only 7 people read the paper, so there weren't a lot of critics, but of the 7, 4 pointed out that maybe the jury wouldn't end up where the average or median juror was, that there was something artificial about our study. So we followed it with a very large mock jury study involving actual deliberating juries, hoping to prove that we were right, that the median was the best predictor. We were wrong. People in deliberating groups, if they're mad, end up much madder than the median individual. People in deliberating groups, if they're feeling lenient, are more lenient than the median individual. Groups end up going to a more extreme point in line with their pre-deliberation tendencies. Having found that with respect to juries making punitive damage judgments about corporate misbehavior, we followed up with a study of political beliefs. And the most currently salient example is climate change. If you get a group of people who are a bit concerned about climate change and think there should be an international agreement, after they talk to each other, they are terrified about climate change and think we should sign an international agreement right now. If you have a group of people who aren't worried about climate change and thinks maybe it's a hoax, even if the distribution of views is varied, and some people think it's probably a problem, international agreements may be a good idea, after they talk to each other, they think the whole thing is ridiculous, it's made up by environmentalist elite, forget about it. And this is real people in Colorado, actually, who went whoosh to the right and whoosh to the left, depending on their pre-deliberation tendency. And that can fortify the 3 moving parts that I've emphasized. Okay, here's the attempted resolution of the mystery of unpredictable movement. First, it's really hard to know what people's preferences are. They can't be observed. Second, people's thresholds are even harder to ascertain. Even if we know people are really upset about something, to know what their thresholds for action is really tough. Even if we could solve those 2 problems, it's very hard to know in advance the nature of social interactions. Now I'm going to give kind of the weak version of the unpredictability claim and then a somewhat stronger version. The weak version I'm going to give with some confidence. The stronger version is tentative. The weak version is that it's just an empirical challenge that we're not close to being able to surmount. The stronger version is it's conceptually impossible and humanity's never going to be able to solve this. Here's a gesture toward defending the stronger version. With Google searches, we can find out something about people's private preferences. If people are Googling a lot, let's say MIT Press books published in April 2019, we'd have some reason to believe that even they're kind of embarrassed to say they're interested in MIT Press books in 2019. That's not the coolest thing, that they're actually interested. I'm trying to give you an example that's not as salacious as the examples that principally provide the data for figuring out what people really care about. There's a book on this, and it's not as ridiculous and a little more off color than the MIT Press book. Okay, so even if we could find from Google searches something about what people really care about, involving politics or products, we wouldn't know what their thresholds are. And even if we could know both of those, we wouldn't know who interacts with whom when. And that's very hard, I think impossible to know, because it depends on accidents often. We might know that probabilistically some movement is more likely than it would otherwise seem if we could observe people's private preferences, but we won't know whether it's going to happen or not, because we won't know who's going to interact with whom and when. No one has that kind of prescience. There's probably a Black Mirror episode in production right now, which is intended as a response to my more ambitious claim, where it's predictable, but I don't believe it. Okay, here's an upshot. It's often tempting in hindsight to say that some movement or reform was consistent with history's arc or was the product of some cultural disposition. But it's more often true that it's a product of some small, random, or serendipitous factor of who did what when, of who heard what when, or whether a butterfly flapped its wings at the right moment. History is only run once, so it's very hard to prove this. History doesn't allow for randomized controlled trials. But when we think that practice or status quo or regime A fell, we often think it was bound to fall. It really wasn't. It happened to fall. The same is true if it doesn't. It happened not to fall. And there's an amazing Spanish Netflix show called something, If I Hadn't Met Her, or If I Hadn't Met You, which is profoundly about exactly this. Counterfactual histories are not observed outside of Netflix and science fiction, but they illuminate the power of serendipitous or seemingly random factors. Okay, having said this about social movements, it must be added that if we have clarity about preference falsification, about diverse thresholds and social interactions, we have some good clues about how to start or stop a social movement. The Chinese government is actually quite alert to some of this, such that the recent data with which, to its credit, the Chinese government has cooperated in the provision of, Gary King, Harvard political scientist, finds that the Chinese government on social media is not censoring disagreement and dissent. Not a lot. If you want to say negative things, that's fine, as a first approximation. But if someone says, we have a protest movement that's meeting Thursday on this street, and there are a lot of people coming, that's not welcome, and that may not find itself taken down. And that's clever in terms of the prevention of social disruption. That if there's advertisement about a large movement at a time certain, then group polarization may kick in, then preference falsification may be undone, and then we may have the kind of social interaction that can get things moving. Okay, this is a bare bones picture, and let's introduce just a few supplemental points. Here's some words from a woman, basically also the day before yesterday, not old, from North Korea. It never occurred to me that I could or would want to do anything about it. It was just how things are. That's an arresting comment. And the most arresting word is want. It never occurred to me that I could or would want to do anything about it. Now, what makes that word important is that this isn't like the Syria tale or the former Nazi. This is a story about preferences that have adapted to the status quo. Her wants were affected by where she found herself. In some cases, people's preferences are adaptive to background conditions, which means they do not have a voice in their head saying, this isn't good. There's very puzzling data from subjective well-being studies, which finds basically that women's happiness relative to men has been going down since the 1970s, and absolutely. So in the period in which women's equality has been on the rise, women's subjective well-being has decreasing. That's a paradox. One explanation for the paradox is that the well-being data from conditions of, let's say, more serious inequality is a product of adaptive preferences. if you live under circumstances of inequality, you may be not rebelling because the inequality seems part of life's furniture. Okay, if we're dealing with preferences that are adaptive or partially adaptive, then it's inadequate to talk about preference falsification. That idea is too simple. Okay, second point. The word preference falsification is underdescriptive. Often what we're talking about is people's experiences and values, not their preferences. Sure, they're concealing or falsifying what they prefer, but they're also concealing their deepest moral beliefs and most searing of all, what actually happened to them. They're either silent about it or they're lying about it. And I'm acutely aware that the incidence of sexual abuse in the United States of children and adults is such that the number of people in this room who've experienced it or who've experienced it in their family is a lot higher than zero. And that's a case study in preference falsification being inadequate. We're talking about silence about experience or about moral convictions. That's worse. That's fake news. We also have to note that if the goal of those who are in favor of the status quo, and it may be a great status quo or a bad one, is to maintain itself, there are a lot of options. You can allow dissent and a disagreement until it becomes too visible. It might be an outlet. You might make concessions, hoping to retain the existing arrangement by doing that. You might bring out guns. You might try persuasion. Or you might agilely take advantage of what we know about the four mechanisms, where the fourth, the kind of supplemental one, is group polarization, to try to stop things before it gets out of hand. Okay, I want to concretize this by talking about hashtag #MeToo. And my hope is that whatever social movement you're interested in or excited by or alarmed by, this will involve mechanisms that are completely adaptable to it. And if they're not completely adaptable to what you're interested in or alarmed by, tell me about it, because that will suggest the incompleteness of the account. Okay, with respect to sexual harassment and sexual assault, preference falsification, needless to say, has been pervasive. Victims have often said all was or is well when not, or they've silenced themselves. As noted, that's not enough, because what many women and many but fewer men did not reveal, what they kept private, was a set of experiences alongside evaluative judgments about those experiences. So experience falsification is really the engine here. Second, different women had and have different thresholds for disclosing their experiences and their judgments. And I'm using women here deliberately, acutely aware that many men, including many men in this room, I hope not many, but at least some men in this room have experienced something like what I'm describing. But because the disproportion number is women, it might efface something not to say that. Okay, some women are ones, others are twos, others are tens, and others are hundreds or infinites. The infinites are especially interesting. They might have some kind of loyalty to the perpetrator. They might not want their lives disrupted. They might cherish their privacy. Some might have no clarity on what their thresholds are, and they and we will learn only ex post. Here are some words from Beverly Young Nelson, who accused Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore of having assaulted her in 1977, and she's very precise on what made her speak out. "I thought I was his only victim. I would probably have taken what he did to me to my grave, had it not been for the courage of 4 other women who were willing to speak out about their experiences. Their courage inspired me to overcome my fear." Third, social interactions are crucial to hashtag #MeToo. Hashtag #MeToo has benefited from the visibility of those who spoke out and the multiple interactions made possible by social media. Taylor Swift was a contributor here with her lawsuit against unwanted touching, but Alyssa Milano was the largest instigator. Within 24 hours of her initial tweet, and I find this almost impossible to believe, but it's so, within 24 hours of her initial tweet asking for hashtag #MeToo to be said, for those who had such experiences, 45% of all Facebook users in the United States had friends in their network who'd posted hashtag #MeToo. Within 24 hours, not a lot less than half. Once the ones and the twos spoke out, the threes and the fours were safer or emboldened. Okay, this account is also very bare bones. And I think we want to emphasize just a couple of points for present purposes. One of the not very recent, but relatively recent electric findings in behavioral sciences points to the power of descriptive social norms. So I'll give you an example. Do you all know about Twitter? It's one of the new social media platforms. Have you heard of Twitter? Or not yet? Do you think I've lost my mind? Okay, so on Twitter, there's a guy I follow who's a behavioral finance guy who wrote a book called, I think, Behavioral Finance, and it's a good book. But as its title suggests, it's not challenging Stephen King for #1 on the bestseller list. So he tweets very frequently, "My book is doing better than expectations. Thank you for the support," which is, I think, literally true and smart. He's suggesting that his book is selling well and is probably doing better than expectations, which were 0. He's not going to lie and say he's doing great, but he says that. Now, what he's doing is invoking a descriptive social norm to the effect that people are buying his book. And we know that if people think that people are recycling, or doctors think that they are not giving antibiotic prescriptions as much as they thought, or that people are paying their taxes in numbers that are really high, we can increase the volume of people who engage in the relevant behavior. That is, invoking the descriptive norm often creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, for better or for worse. Okay, that's an old finding. The new finding, which is not widely known, but I think is as electrifying, is if you don't have a great existing social norm, point to an emerging social norm. Say people are increasingly doing X, or X within your group is the current trend. The reference to the dynamic social norm often fuels behavior, and hashtag #MeToo has benefited from both of those. Okay, we have to note that with respect to hashtag #MeToo, we're not speaking only of revelation of preferences and experiences, but also about the transformation of preferences and beliefs and values. I'm going to tell you something a little bit personal here, and this isn't very characteristic, but I find what we're now describing both relevant to politics and law and kind of powerfully relevant to personal life. And here's my example. A long time ago, when feminism was just starting in legal circles, I was interested in it and started writing a bit about it and editing a book about it. And I told my mother, who's no longer alive, that she asked, "What are you working on?" And I told her. And she thought that was not a good idea. She said, "You're a constitutional law guy. Don't you work on the Administrative Procedure Act?" She was a very supportive mother. I said, "Why are you working on this? That's crazy stuff." And I said, "Well, there's some really good work being done." And she said, "Stick with the Administrative Procedure Act." And finally, I told her what Catherine McKinnon and Martha Minow and others were working on, and went at some length about my reading. And she said with 3 words that she'd never said before and she never said after. She paused and she said with indescribable emotion, she said, "God bless you." And what I thought was in those three words was an assortment of personal experiences she herself had had that she never told anybody about. And that with those words, she was signaling, which is to say that #MeToo, as in many social movements, is not just about the revelation of preferences, beliefs, and values. It's also about their transformation. Most obviously, in this case, on the part of perpetrators, but equally relevantly on the part of victims. Any social movement doesn't just unleash pre-existing values. It casts a new light on existing experiences. It produces fresh ones. Part of the point of civil rights movements of multiple different kinds, right and left, and one of their greatest achievements, and I hope if there's anything you remember from these remarks, it's this, is to transform a sense of embarrassment and shame into a sense of dignity. Okay, final words. Recall in this light the testimony of a computer programmer recently from Syria. When you first meet somebody coming out of Syria for the first time, you start to hear the same sentences, that everything is okay. It'll take like 6 months, up to 1 year, for them to become a normal human being again, to say what they think, what they feel. Then they might start whispering. They won't speak loudly, but eventually they might. Thanks.
Thanks again to the President and Fellows of Harvard College for allowing us to use that copyrighted presentation. We now go to my conversation with Professor Sunstein. I knew I only had an hour with him, and I had a very long list of questions to ask, so we dove right in. So I know you're a very busy guy, so thanks for coming on the podcast, Cass.
A great pleasure, an honor.
Yeah, listeners will have just heard you giving a presentation explaining the core content of the book, How Change Happens. In my mind, you bring up 4 key concepts. Firstly, preference falsification. Secondly, differing thresholds for action between people. And thirdly, group polarization once people actually start organizing themselves. And then you add those 3 together and suggest that they, along with the inherent randomness of who talks to who, when, and what they do, makes social change really fundamentally unpredictable. So let's dive into discussing how accurate all of that is, and I guess what implications it has for all of us who would like to make a better world. The book's been out for 3 or 4 months now. What do you think people have most misunderstood or underappreciated about it?
Well, I've actually been really gratified that people have focused on the idea that there's an interaction between social norms and the unleashing of what's actually inside people's heads. So the kind of principal theme is that we all have in our minds goals and commitments and aspirations and experiences to which we don't give voice. And sometimes that's good because our commitments might be awful, and we know it, and so we shut up about them. But sometimes it's not so good when our commitments are honorable or justified, and there's something in our community that makes us not say anything. And people have really picked up on that. I think it resonates with both the right and the left. I confess I haven't seen misunderstandings, so pleased about that, or maybe just this is motivated reasoning so that I've blinded myself to the misunderstandings.
Why did it take you decades to kind of put together everything you needed to finish the book?
I started with what's now Chapter 3, the expressive function of law, and I thought there was a core of something there, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. And so it took, I think, subsequent work on group judgments, and that's now Chapter 2, and how like-minded people end up going to extremes and how to think about that. Sometimes that's part of democracy at its best. Sometimes it's creates horror. And the exposure probably to the work of Timur Kuran, who writes on preference falsification, and he became a co-author in the late 1990s, that postdated. And probably my immersion in behavioral science which started after actually thinking about the expressive function of law, was what ultimately made the book possible.
Have you heard any kind of good arguments against the vision of how society changes that you've presented in the book? Have you gotten any pushback that's changed your opinions?
Some people have said something that's in the book, but maybe not highlighted adequately, which is that often the consequence of a norm change is that you create new values and commitments that didn't exist before. So I've heard from many interlocutors that the emphasis on unleashing what's inside people's heads isn't exactly wrong, but it's excessive. If you think of, let's say, the movement for animal rights or the movement to ban smoking in public places, or the movement for preventing discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, a lot of that isn't about liberating people to say what they think, but about changing values. And that interacts well with another concern that people have raised, which is that people often adapt their preferences and their values to a sense of what's possible. Jan Elster, the great Norwegian political theorist, has spurred work on the adaptation of preferences to what's around. And people have said that deserves a great deal of emphasis. It is in the book, but it could have been foregrounded a bit more.
Yeah, that's one of the questions I had about the book. Like, how much do you think social change is driven by these falsified preferences? I guess especially in a country like the United States, where although you can be socially sanctioned for saying things that are unacceptable, you're unlikely to be thrown in jail or beaten up or killed or anything like that. Which I think is where kind of Timur was originally doing his work on preference falsification. It was about revolutions in dictatorships.
Yes, I think a lot, even in the United States and the United Kingdom and France and Canada, countries that do have either formal freedom or formal freedom plus cultures of, let's say, welcoming dissent, I think still a lot. So I'll give a few examples. The movement for same-sex marriage, clearly it's the case that the closet was a devastation for the movement for that. And as the closet started to open up, then something started to move. It's much bigger than that, though, that heterosexuals who were fine with same-sex marriage or who were fine with equality or even wanted it, they were closeted too. And the existence of a shifting norm unleashed people like my mother. I'm heterosexual, but my mother kind of talked as if she was homophobic until at a certain point she said that's ridiculous. And she always had a voice in her head saying that's ridiculous. And that happened to many millions of people in free countries. I think John Stuart Mill was on this point, that we often underestimate the extent to which conformity pressures are squelching behavior, even in quite free nations. And Mill, his lived experience with an illicit love affair with Harriet Taylor, which ended up creating terrible disruption in his relations with his family and his friends, I think he spoke for that. And what Mill encountered when he violated a norm in his own community, all of us, I think, are in a sense afraid of. And I mean, that's a strong statement, but I mean it that strongly. Not like we're, terrified or cowering, but in some sense, all of us are scared of what happened to Mill.
Maybe the line between these two can be a little bit blurred, because it seems in the case of gay marriage, probably lots of people had never really thought about it. They didn't have some like hidden preference in favor of gay marriage, but it was the case that because people who were gay were not speaking up about their own experiences, that they were failing to be persuaded where they could have been persuaded quite easily if the conversation was happening much more in the open.
Yeah. So one big part of the movement for gay marriage is the unleashing through the softening of social norms of gays and lesbians to say, I love this person, I want to marry him. You're not allowing me. And the other thing that happened was that many heterosexuals who went around kind of laughing in a homophobic way or thinking same-sex marriage, that's ridiculous. But in their head, they didn't really think that. They shifted. But as you say, you're quite right that a number of people didn't think about it much or thought of the ban on same-sex marriage as just part of life's furniture. And as the possibility opened up, they started considering it. But what I want to focus on, because I think it's particularly intriguing for extremely rapid social change, is when a dam breaks. And many social movements, large and small, are exercises in dam breaking, where a social norm operated as a tax on behavior so that you couldn't do it without facing something like a fine. And then the tax diminishes, or what was once a tax becomes a subsidy. So you're better off if you say what you think.
Yeah, I guess I wonder what lessons there are here for activists, especially ones who are willing to campaign on kind of a wide range of issues, whichever ones they think are more promising. Do you think it's easier to get social change when kind of people have hidden preferences that agree with you, or rather than cases where you kind of have to actually go and persuade them because they sincerely do disagree?
The first is much easier. So the fact that President Trump got elected and that Brexit came out the way it did is a tribute to the existence of pro-Trump and pro-Brexit sentiment that had been stopped by social norms. And once the norm started to shift, then something extremely surprising in both cases could happen. That's the easier one. And activists do have some lessons, which are, first, if you can draw attention to a social norm that people haven't realized is in place, that is, people are with you. You don't know it. Say what you think. That can be extremely effective. And many activists are at some level aware of that. The other thing, which is very recent data, I'm not even sure it made it into the book, is that if people see a norm not as in place, but as emerging, then they are inspired to join, partly because then they feel freed, but partly, to your point, they might not know what they think, but they want to be on the right side of history. So for activists to say increasing numbers of people is smart.
In light of that, one point you make in the book is that it can be incredibly hard to figure out what people's hidden preferences are and kind of what are people's thresholds for actions, and sometimes even they don't know it. But it seems like people campaigning for social change, both progressive and conservative, maybe they should be spending half of their resources just engaging in like very extensive public surveys to try to figure out where people already agree with them, because those campaigns are just likely to be so much more successful than ones where they're kind of banging their head against a wall because people actually just sincerely disagree. Yeah, do you think it's maybe something that political parties or campaign groups should invest like really serious resources in finding out?
Well, I think to tell people how to allocate money is hazardous business, but certainly it's a wise approach both to target existing views which people haven't felt free to signal. And there's research that can help you find out what those are. Google knows a lot about that. There's a nice book called Everybody Lies, which is about things that Google knows. And some of it's really surprising. It's an avenue into uncovering what private preferences are. And to have as a strategy that to disclose a fact. I'll give you a little study from Saudi Arabia, which is that Saudi men by custom have authority over whether their wives work outside the home. And most young Saudi men actually think it's fine that their wives work outside of the home, but most young Saudi men think it's not fine. So they think they're isolated in their openness to wives that are working outside of the home. In the experiment, once Saudi men were informed that most Saudi men actually think like them, then the number of Saudi women applying to join the workforce grew dramatically 4 months later. And that was a research study, not a feminist program. But there's a clue there about programs of all sorts.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It seems like you could just almost conduct kind of scattershot surveys of like try to find lots of cases where maybe people's like private views are somewhat different than their public views and where they agree with you, and then just publicize the results every time you find out that in fact like lots of people already agree with you. So,
yes,
yeah.
Completely. And President Trump does use this. I'm completely bracketing whether we like or love or don't like President Trump, but he's very intuitive about this, saying that most people think X. And he's often not wrong. Most might be a little too strong, but many, and that is a little bit social proof.
So the rate at which you seem to write books is pretty phenomenal, because just 2 months after publishing How Change Happens, just last month you published a book called Conformity, which goes into even more detail about this issue of group polarization. I'll stick up a link to an extract from that book, which I found very thought-provoking. How confident are you that the evidence for group polarization will stand up in the replication crisis? And are there any circumstances where groups kind of moderate rather than extremize? It seems like they can't always be extremizing, or the world would just be absolutely wacky.
Okay, so these are great questions. So actually, my conformity book, I based on lectures that I'd never published that were published in 2003. And I had fondness for them, and I'd been working over them over the years. And I relatively recently thought maybe I should put them together as a book. So conformity took about 16 years, and the other took 25. So I feel like the tortoise, not the hare. So that's that. On the replication crisis, I have maybe an idiosyncratic view, which is what happens in Syria these days, or in what's happened certainly over the last period in Syria, that's a crisis. Climate change is arguably a crisis. I think it's fair to deem it a crisis. If there's an earthquake, there's a crisis. The idea of a replication crisis strikes me as, it has become the term, but it strikes me as, what's the
hyperbole?
To say it's hyperbole is an understatement. It's true. It's hyperbole, but only academics, I think, would think that the failure of some of their research to replicate is a crisis rather than learning. Now, the fact that we've gotten more disciplined about ensuring that a finding isn't a one-off, or a finding isn't an artifact of a particular, let's say, fraudulent or inadequate design, that's very important, and that is progress. So that's great. I was very obsessive about the group polarization material, and it's been replicated, countless times. So we don't have just one group polarization study. I've been involved in numerous ones myself, and it's always happened. But I'm a very modest contributor to the empirical research. So it's a very robust finding. Now, the finding means that like-minded people talking with one another typically end up in a more extreme position in line with their antecedent tendencies. And that is, in typical form, what will happen within deliberating groups. But try to be clear in the book on in the book Conformity, and it probably made its way into How Change Happens also, about the circumstances when it won't happen. So Jim Fishkin, an excellent political theorist at Stanford, has done a deliberative opinion poll where he does not observe group polarization. And one reason is he supplies people with information that isn't self-generated by the group, information for and against various positions. So if you have some epistemic intervention, then that will undermine the mechanisms that lead to group polarization. So that's one. If you have a group of people that consists of let's say two sets of subgroups which are equally opposed, then they aren't going to polarize. They're just going to entrench themselves typically. Now, if they have some softening capacity, then something surprising can happen. But typically, four people who think Israel's the greatest country and never did anything wrong, four people think Israel's the worst country and they've done everything wrong, they're not going to move each other. They might end up liking or hating each other, but they're not going to polarize in the way described. A cool finding is that for what are called eureka problems, where the answer once announced is clear to all, we observe consensus on the right answer, not group polarization. It's why a large group of people can solve a crossword puzzle where someone will say, 4 letters. What's the word for going south? Down. And that's how they feel it. And they say, that's it. That works. And so for that, you won't observe polarization. Also, some things can happen in individual groups where you could have a charismatic or extremely informed participant who thinks that the dominant tendency is wrong. And then the group, I haven't done any experiment where this actually happened, though I've done a lot, but in the world it happens where a charismatic, informed person can be like someone who says down 4 letters going south and moves the entire group in his or her preferred direction.
Yeah, I know a group that has kind of explicitly aimed to use group polarization to radicalize its own members and make them more committed to their work. And I guess they hope that these radicals will then kind of form a vanguard that will go on and convince the rest of society of their views. And I got to say, I find this makes me feel pretty squeamish because it's kind of deliberately making kind of your members less reasonable and have less of a balanced overall opinion. But it does seem like it could be justified in some cases if that's kind of the only way that you could get an outcome that was desirable. Do you have any feelings about that approach to social change?
Yeah, I share your view. Everything you said, I agree with. So suppose you believe, let's say, that climate change is a serious problem and we should do something about it. The preferred way to move in the direction of that goal is to persuade others that it's true, not to have, let's say, a climate change camp where people are deliberately heating themselves up, so to speak. Now, if it's climate change camp where people are exchanging information so that they know what they're talking about, it's designed for learning and moral commitment rather than for group dynamics, that's better. On the other hand, you can imagine circumstances where, let's say, a polarization entrepreneur is trying to combat something horrible and doesn't mind the fact that the social dynamics in the group are going to create an extremely committed and extreme set of people. That's not out of bounds, but it would be a little bit of I think.
You really got to hope you're right.
an emergency situation.
When you get groups together, sometimes they must extremize just because they become more informed. They kind of share information, and it turns out that kind of an extreme position is the correct one. It's not always the case that moderating is the right thing to do. Do you have any thoughts on kind of norms that groups can follow that can help them tell the difference between warranted and unwarranted extremization?
Okay, I think you made a very important point, and let's press a little on the factual predicate, and you're right. And it's a kind of a double-edged sword. So first question is, why do groups end up going in a more extreme position in line with their pre-deliberation tendency? Why, if you have a group of people who think that occupational safety is the number one issue and workers are dying at an extremely high rate, why do they end up being more extreme in that position after they talk with one another? And the principal reason, I think, though the data, I'd be more careful on reflection than saying it's the principal reason. It's not less than any other reason is probably the more accurate way to put it. Is just information exchange. So within a group that's worried about occupational safety, by definition, the number of arguments that support the concern will be more than the number of arguments that undermine the concern. And so if people are listening to one another, they will hear more arguments in favor of the position. And that's going to lead to polarization. Now, that has nothing to do with anything invidious. It doesn't have to do with bounded rationality. It just has to do with information exchange within a group. Okay, but here's the kind of kicker in terms of rationality, that people in groups are not inclined to discount for their group's composition. So there's insufficient thinking that, okay, I'm learning from these people, but these people aren't the only people in the world, and maybe the information flow within the group is unrepresentative of the information that's there. So even if information is the driver of group polarization, it can lead people in not very good directions. So if that happens, what you want, I think, is a group where people can participate in enclaves of like-minded types. That's part of freedom of association. But you want to make sure also that social architecture, let's say, makes it easy or likely that participants within the enclave will be exposed to other stuff too. And if they are exposed to other stuff, it's not like to hold it up as if it's a piece of dirt and say, look how ridiculous it is. This may sound a little bit abstract, but you can think of a newspaper or the BBC or Facebook as being able to create enclaves or to broaden, let's say, the enclave exposure to other stuff.
I saw an interesting paper recently suggesting that people are very worried about, like groupthink in online communities, but it actually seems like people's real life groups are even more enclaves of particular views. It's like you think about your housemates, your family, or your colleagues. They're kind of almost even more grossly selected than the friends you encounter on Twitter or Facebook, which is kind of interesting spin on things.
I'd be careful about the data on that. The data goes kind of both ways, and it may be that within your neighborhood, the amount of epistemic diversity, let's say, is lower than the amount of epistemic diversity on your Facebook page. That might be. I don't think we actually have a clear answer to that. But that might not mean that the epistemic diversity on, let's say, Facebook, which is greater by hypothesis. We're not agreeing, but we're hypothesizing that is helping. Because it might be your neighbors, you talk to them about the weather and your families and activities there, not about politics or causes. But it might be, it might be on Twitter and on Facebook, it's the news feed, which is potentially a polarization machine.
Yeah, I guess one thing is you might like the people who you meet in real life to a greater degree, and so take their views more seriously. It's like easier to have contempt for people on the internet.
Yeah, that is so.
Yeah, I wondered, as I was reading the section on group polarization, whether it's possible that part of it could be an illusion because basically people want to fit into a group, and so they start misleading, they start lying about what their views are. You're basically getting preference falsification within these experiments because people are just trying to go along to get along.
I have data on this.
Oh, great.
So one of my projects involved citizens, both to right of center and left of center, in which their views were collected anonymously, pre-deliberation. Then the groups went to a verdict publicly on climate change, issues involving racial discrimination and same-sex unions. And then they were asked to record their views anonymously after. And their anonymous views were really close to the views they expressed in groups. Not the same, but really close, which supports your view. There is a degree of preference falsification, but in this study it's small, and the shift in views from what happened in the private anonymous view before they talked to like-minded others and how they recorded their views anonymously after they talked to like-minded others. That was what I was most interested in, and it's really dramatic. So their anonymous view shifted as a result of speaking with others. And that fits with some of the original conformity experiments where you have people defying the evidence of their own senses in order to agree with the group. And a certain number of them did say, I knew what I was seeing and they were crazy, but I didn't want to look like an idiot in front of everyone. But others said, I thought this is what I was seeing, but since everyone else thought otherwise, I went along with them. I guess I was wrong.
Yeah, I'm kind of sympathetic with those people because it seems like just in normal life, kind of going along to get along is actually potentially a good strategy for often achieving your goals because you just don't want to be making trouble and enemies all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the first account of conformity and also group polarization, which feeds into the change theme, is that people are learning from others and they actually do change their views. The other is that they are not learning, but they are trying not to be unpopular or be excluded, and so they're really quieting themselves. I'll tell you a personal example, which I've actually never talked about publicly, so I'm pleased to do that here because it is closely connected to your point. I worked in the White House for 4 years, and the position I had to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate, and I almost didn't get through because of my work on animal welfare and such. It was truly a nightmare with death threats and ridicule. And ridicule is okay. Death threats, not a whole lot of fun. And since that, I have been much quieter about animal welfare and animal rights. I'm going to start to get less quiet. I haven't been completely quiet, but I didn't not notice the extent of let's say, conformity pressures that were surrounding me.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. I think I would probably button up if I started getting death threats as well. This actually kind of leads into my next question, because I was going to say, if we're to believe the book, it seems like kind of rebels and contrarians and people who are willing to accept death threats kind of can have a very outsized impact on society's directions. So like typically their ideas won't take off, but every so often they just set off a massive cascade that goes far beyond anything that they could have directly accomplished. Do you think we should kind of pay more attention to idea rebels and contrarians and potentially try to become them if we're willing to bear the personal cost involved?
Well, certainly to pay more attention to them is really important, though to pay more attention to them for what is a natural follow-up question. So to pay more attention to them to think about how change happens is crucial. So if you think about the rise of the feminist movement, the rise of the civil rights movement, there are people who were and are by nature rebels. They don't need social support. They're relatively indifferent to the informational signals they're getting from the majority. They think the majority is full of nonsense. And they're relatively indifferent to staying in the good graces of people. They say what they think. And so to pay attention to them as, even if their names never end up in the history books, as essential, that's really important. The category of rebels is so large, and it includes, people who are literally crazy, or people who just have a anger management problem, or people who are fastening on something, that is a cause that has no merit. So I wouldn't want to glorify them independent of what it is they're doing. People who kill people are often fighting for a cause which they sincerely are committed to. There's a paper that has been cited many times, but hardly anyone's ever seen it because it's never been published. It's called Misfits and Social Progress by a superb behavioral economist called David Hirschleifer. And he has written the paper, but he hasn't published it. I'm trying to get him to publish it, but it's right on your point about understanding the extent to which people have very low thresholds for acting and are impervious more or less to social pressures are important for social progress.
Do you think that the kind of people that you know and potentially listeners in the audience are too cautious about being outspoken because they're worried about how it might limit, future government careers or other careers? Or do you think they're not cautious enough? Do you have any sense?
Well, I'll give a reckless answer, which is yes, they're too cautious. So I think the median human being errs toward undue caution. The median human being doesn't err in the direction of civility and grace. There's almost, in my view, no way of erring if you're being civil and gracious. And so that's kind of, close to bedrock. But most human beings have moral convictions that deserve airing, or experiences they've had that are shared, and they shouldn't happen to other people. And to ratchet it up in a way that's respectful and civil is usually a good thing.
Do you worry that if we had kind of too many idea entrepreneurs or too many rebels, that society could become a bit of a jumble? There'd be like too much conflict and too rapid social change. That maybe we need a lot of people to just be boring to kind of hold everything together.
Well, so it's a good question, and we need to know what society we're living in. So if we're living in a society which is fundamentally good, then to have respect for the informational signals given by others and to have people concerned about what other people think about them is really important. If you live in a society that's a horror show of injustice and oppression, then the norm should be one of struggling against it. And if you're on a continuum, my country, I think, is closer to the first. Not perfect by any means, but not a horror show. Probably can do a little more. Now, I'm in favor of respecting the law. So civil disobedience, I think, would be last resort. That is an instrument for chaos. We don't want lawbreakers. courtesy and civility are good, but it's often good for self as well as for society for people to say what they think. Now, we want to be careful about that because it's all pervaded by substance. If people think that, people of certain skin colors are inferior, that it's not so great if they're broadcasting that. Or if they think that people of certain religious convictions should be in jail or deported, that's not very good to have as a welcome statement. So, in the abstract, norms in favor of self-silencing might be really important. They make stability and peace possible.
You mentioned that the Chinese Communist Party allows people to air grievances. It just doesn't allow them to kind of coordinate to promote a revolution. And part of the reason they do that is so that they can keep tabs on what people actually think, so that they don't become unaware of massive discontent in the population. I wonder, a lot of people in countries like the US or the UK they put their activist energies into trying to discourage people from expressing bad views that they don't want to get a foothold and don't want to spread. But I wonder whether this does create this risk that then you have a lot of people who disagree with them, who are kind of biting their tongues, and then it can kind of all explode all at once. And maybe you want to moderate that a little bit so that you can have a more accurate sense of what people sincerely think.
Let me offer, if I may, my limited understanding of what's happening in China, based on my limited understanding of the empirical research. But I think this is what's happening in China. That on social media, dissent, as you say, is generally permitted. I'm not aware that the reason for permitting dissent is to keep tabs on what people are saying. That might be true, but I don't know that to be true. The idea is if there's dissent, that's okay. The Chinese government's response appears to be to add to the system a lot of different voices, that is, voices of celebration of how things are going, not to censor. But if someone says on social media, we're having a demonstration in a specific place at a specific time, please come, that might well be taken down. And that, in terms of protecting the stability of the system, that's clever, and it fits with a lot of the things we've been discussing. So a concern is that you can create a cascade or a polarization machine if you have like-minded people ending up in a certain place at a certain time. You might give a kind of green light or license to activity that had formerly been pressed against by social norms. So that seems to be a clever strategy, I think. To your point that if a society, let's say, that's at risk is imposing self-consciously through the government or through private institution, political correctness, let's call it writ large, not just left-leaning institutions of higher learning, but political correctness, it may be that people will feel that they've been treated disrespectfully. They might feel their dignity has been assaulted, and it's possible that they'll be held to pay. And I think a lot depends on what types they are and the firmness with which they hold their convictions. So this could be modeled in very precise economic terms. As a first approximation, if you can get away with producing, whether you're a government or a private employer, if you can get away with inculcating a norm of a certain kind, that's not a silly project, even if some people are going to abide by the norm while they're gritting their teeth.
What's your best guess for a kind of currently hidden position within the United States that a social entrepreneur could kind of take advantage of? Did you have any guesses for what the next revolution in ideas might be?
Well, it's in the nature of the beast that it's going to be really hard, and that I think is interesting. So the reason it's going to be really hard is that first you have a hard time knowing what's inside people's heads. Google knows probably more than any institution ever has, but it doesn't know a whole lot, really, compared to what's there in people's heads. And even if you know what's in people's heads, you don't know what their thresholds are for acting or speaking out. They might have in their heads, I care about pesticides a lot, but they might have a lot of things to do. So to do something about pesticides would take maybe a lot of social support or a feeling of crisis. And even if you knew what's in people's heads, and even if you knew what their thresholds were, social interactions are essential to getting something off the ground. So you need the right people talking to the right people at the right time. And that's, I think, in the nature of the thing, not possible to anticipate. There's a terrific new paper, Duncan Watts is one of the co-authors, of the difficulty of predicting in real time what's going to happen in history. And his study is actually of a much more tractable question, which is whether people in the national security area who are reporting to the United States State Department about historic events in real time, do they actually know what was a historic event? As by decades later, what became historic? And the answer is actually they didn't. They weren't completely random, but basically they were way off the mark. And Arthur Danto, the philosopher of history, actually tried to explain this in 1965, that if you're an ideal observer in real time seeing something, and I'm far from an ideal observer in response to your question, but even if you had an ideal observer, he or she wouldn't know the sets of interactions and subsequent events that have to happen in order for something to become real. Now, having given all those disclaimers, I'll give you the one example, I think, where it's not completely reckless to anticipate something possibly happening, and that is animal welfare. And the reason is that it has some features in common with gay marriage and with feminism, where there are many people who are concerned about animal welfare, but they don't say so because of social sanctions, or they don't say so because they're just focused on many other things too. What we have is a potential there, given the existence of preference falsification or openness. We have the potential for a lot of people doing something, and economic developments are making it more feasible. I just had my first Impossible Burger a few days ago.
They're really good.
And they're really good. To distinguish the Impossible Burger from the best hamburger you've ever had, I think is hard, and I am not an investor in the company. So as the availability of substitutes becomes easier, the moral conviction may come to the fore.
Yeah, I was actually going to suggest that as possibly one that we've seen evidence that it's not going to take off, because kind of objections to the treatment of animals have been around for a long time, and kind of many people sort of agree, but people are eating more meat than ever before, and it hasn't really had the kind of virality, or it hasn't created a social cascade over the last 40 years. So I was going to suggest maybe this is evidence that this idea it isn't really right for social cascade, and so possibly people should move on to other issues or attempt other approaches to try to solve it, because there just aren't enough people kind of at every level of willingness to speak up that can create a full-blown kind of avalanche.
Well, a famous American baseball player once said predictions are hard, especially about the future. And so I'm cautious here. But John Stuart Mill wrote The Subjection of Women a long, long time ago. And the feminist movement didn't take off in his direction for decades and decades and decades and decades and decades. The idea that slavery was a bad thing was around at the time the U.S. Constitution was ratified. In fact, it was around big time. It wasn't until the Civil War that it was abolished. So the fact that the animal rights movement or animal welfare movement has had, let's say, incomplete success over the last 40 years, I wouldn't take that as a powerful evidence that it's not one of these areas. I'm not even sure it's evidence at all, given the alacrity with which movements move once they start.
Yeah, there is some evidence that there is kind of a suppressed opinions that are ripe to change. If you do public opinion surveys, you find that the vast majority of people say that they think it's wrong to cause farm animals to suffer. And then when you present them with the inconsistency with the fact that they eat meat, they resolve it by saying that they think that farm animals don't suffer, but that actually the conditions are good, which is obviously kind of a farcical response. So I suppose it suggests that if you could I guess if you're suggesting if you could make it cheaper to be vegetarian or vegan, and you could make it very difficult for people to kind of resolve that inconsistency by just claiming that farming is actually humane, then maybe you could get quite a rapid change in behavior.
Right. The behavioral insights team in the United Kingdom, with whom I'm privileged to work occasionally, has easy, attractive, social, and timely, EAST, as a mantra for social change. So if you make something easy, the likelihood that people will do it increases often much more dramatically than one would ever expect. So we have in the United States 15 million children enjoying free, nutritious school meals. These are poor kids who are entitled to the meals because we have a policy that automatically enrolls them. They don't have to be in, they can opt out, but it's really easy. They're just in. And so to make Impossible Burgers or vegetarian alternatives easy would have a big impact. Social refers to the social norm, the S in EAST. A means attractive. So to have something that is not seeming kind of fussy and elitist and high-minded, but instead attractive. There's something I learned very recently after the book that's closely connected with one of the themes of the book, which is Amazon sells certain packages in what's called frustration-free packaging. And I know this because I get electric shavers, and electric razors, to take them out of normal packaging is a nightmare. So I leaped at the idea of frustration-free packaging, and it's a wonderful godsend. And then I looked up frustration-free packaging. What's it about? It's about sustainability. It's an environmental thing. It's all recyclable. It's less solid waste, no plastic. And it looks as if the real motivation is environmental, but they don't sell it that way. They sell it as frustration-free packaging. That's the A, attractive. And T means timely. Just have it so that people see the relevant thing when it matters.
One way that I thought kind of moral circle expansions like animal welfare or worrying about like ways that we're harming future generations maybe different from previous revolutions is that in the past you could have gay people speak up in favor of gay marriage because it affects them personally, but we're now kind of at the stage where we're talking about animals and future generations, groups that kind of can't speak up for themselves and can't advocate for their own welfare. Do you think that's going to be kind of a barrier potentially to getting these moral revolutions to take off in the same way as past ones have?
Yes. I mean, with climate change, when I worked in the U.S. government, we did things, including a clean power plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, a fuel economy standard for automobiles, one for trucks, energy efficiency standards for appliances, and the effect in reducing greenhouse gas emissions of all these things was massive. And one of the motivations for these greenhouse gas reduction initiatives was protection of future generations. And while the current administration has repealed some of these things, it hasn't by any means come close to repealing all of them. And so the future generation idea is something to which current people are willing to attend, and empathy is real. With the number of white people who marched for civil rights really high. The number of men who have worked on behalf of sex equality is also really high. The Supreme Court of the United States actually very controversially to many ruled that sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination. And it was either all or almost all men who joined that ruling. I think of the 9, there were 8. And a moral motivation. It was a legal judgment, but it had a moral component to it.
As I was thinking about the kind of the social cascade model, it seems like in order to have an idea kind of explode and go to saturation where almost everyone agrees with it, you kind of need to have people at every stage of willingness to speak up. So I guess you have this like number system in the book. We've got like zeros will speak up any time, no matter what. Then you've got ones who will speak up if the zeros speak up, and twos who speak up if the ones speak up, and so on. And it seems like if you kind of have a break in that chain where it's like we get to 5, but then there just aren't many 6s, 7s, 8s, and 9s, but there's a whole lot of people who would speak up, but then they're at level 10. Then it kind of you can get stuck. You get to this hump where there's a bunch of people who agree, but then you just can't get any further without, I guess, like some external shock to push the 10s to start speaking out. Do you think that's kind of a right way to conceptualize this?
Completely. It's, of course, a very stylized version of reality, and it reduces the complexity of human behavior to a few numbers. But like many stylized, it's informative. So you need, for many social movements to start, you need people who will do it, even if they have no social support. Rosa Parks was one. I think Peter Singer, the philosopher who works on animal rights, is another. Martin Luther King's probably a zero, meaning he'd go even if he didn't have much social support. And then there are people who will join them. They'll be their first lieutenant, but they need to see the zero first. And then there are others who need to see the first lieutenant and the zeros. And this is how movements often develop. But you're completely right that if there are no twos or no visible twos, then the threes are just going to go about their business. And you can get stuck if you can't find fives and sixes. So often a social movement will happen, even a very dramatic one that will change a country. But it wasn't inevitable. It seems inevitable in retrospect. It wasn't. It needed the fives and sixes to be visible and present, and things that we never see, or music that never gets popular, or movies that fail. It's a product of the fives and sixes don't appear. They either aren't there or no one sees them.
Yeah, I guess it kind of means that everyone is kind of essential, yeah, because it's like as soon as you break the chain, then there's potential for the movement to stagnate. So I guess people should look out for like what things are they kind of the next person who can speak out on this issue to push it along, and you can like seek out lots of cases where you're the next person who's willing to push it forward.
Yes. Fortunately, we're talking about a kind of temporal queue with people with numbers assigned to them. Societies are sufficiently large that the number of fives and sixes may be 400,000. And if some of them are visible and willing to move because they see the people before them, then something will happen. If you look at what happened in the Arab Spring, by the way, it has many features in common with what we're discussing, where the US government and the UK government did not anticipate the Arab Spring. It's kind of a case study in cascade effects, both within countries and across countries, where what had to be done was there were rebels, famous incident in Tunisia, which was very important. There are rebels who are seen, and then there are maybe rebels, and then there are maybe rebels, and then there are the maybe rebels. And that's basically what happened in many countries a few years ago.
Is there any where in your model for kind of outspoken activists turning people off their ideas? So it does seem like you can have kind of the wrong people who pioneer a movement and give it a bad name, and they can make it even then harder for other people to speak out because then they have to affiliate with these other people who just seem crazy or generally unappealing.
Yeah, that's very important. It's not in the book, but it probably should have been. I'm trying to think of examples, but it's clearly the case that if you have someone who is unattractive in any one of a number of ways, or is a hypocrite or something, that they can put the whole movement in disrepute. I think one reason, by the way, that I'm struggling to think of examples is that we focus a lot on movements that succeed, the anti-smoking movement, the feminist movement to a large extent, certainly the civil rights movement, Brexit, Trump, the movement for buckling your seatbelt. These are all within memory, successful movements. The movements that fail are elusive to the mind, but there's a counterfactual in which they didn't fail, and science fiction writers are very good at developing them. It takes imagination, but the fact that it's a counterfactual history, a movement that never got off the ground, it may well be a product of let's say, the opposite of charismatic leader, or a really strategically foolish leader. And then we don't know about the movement.
Yeah, one case that I've heard about is I think the animal rights movement in the UK. The well was really poisoned by a few people who engaged in kind of terrorist actions against animal labs with animal testing. I don't think they actually killed anyone, but nonetheless, it really discouraged, I think, moderates from getting involved because they kind of had a violent reputation, and kind of leveled out for a while.
That's great. I mean, it's not great, but it's a great example.
Do you have any sense of how you can go out and find out about like movements that almost succeeded or crashed? It seems like we need much more of a database of these and much more understanding of them.
Yeah, well, there's some historical work, and this is something I've scratched the surface on only, like of constitutions that failed, which is a way in, because constitutions are often statements of basic principle by people who have views that never got anywhere. So to look at constitutions that were produced, that's one avenue. To think very inventively about movements that never succeeded. They could be religions and their variants of Christianity. This is all extremely interesting. And there's a very good book that uses informational cascades to explore a network theory, to explore the triumph of Christianity. Some of the work on Gnosticism and the Apocrypha is very interesting in this regard.
Yeah, I like the idea of doing constitutions, or I guess, theology, because those ones are nicely written down, or they're nicely legible in a way that some other like social movements that are just about people's opinions and groups are less written down. You point out in the book that kind of if a group consists of just people, then it tends to be less polarization than if it consists of Republicans or defenders of the Second Amendment or pro-choice activists. And I guess given the importance of reasonableness and just having true beliefs for the effective altruism community, do you think we should just tend to identify as kind of people who are interested in effective altruism rather than call ourselves effective altruists, which is kind of a bit of a cringe term anyway?
Okay, so the fact that solidarity can diminish dissent and lead to more polarization, more unity, more confidence, more extremism, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So if you have a movement, let's say, for human decency, and that people become extremely unified and committed to the idea of decency, and I'm using that word as a placeholder for a value that is unambiguously good, the fact that it's citizens for human decency rather than people is instrumentally good. So it's Hume, you can't get an ought from an is. So the fact that a particular identification or label can increase the likelihood and intensity of polarization, that might be a good thing.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess I feel like with effective altruism, not falling into the trap of just having group solidarity where we all agree with one another is especially important because the whole idea is that we'd be willing to change what we're doing and what we think in response to new evidence. And so it should be like an underlying set of principles that can adapt to new circumstances rather than a campaign that runs its course.
I'll give you an example that I've thought a little bit about. I'm a fan of effective altruism. I'm not an expert. I've been to one of the meetings and I admire what's being done there. There's a online journal out of Australia called Quillette, which is often described as part of the internet dark web. And it basically is, as I read it, I'm not a, read everything in it person, but as I read it, it's trying to be empirical about questions where often some kind of orthodoxy is, in the not unreasonable view of the authors, defeating empiricism. So it might be asking questions about gender difference in a way that borrows from evolutionary psychology, or it might be writing about the firing of some person on a university campus in a way that reflected unwillingness to listen or allow a presence of someone who had, let's say, a right of center view or right of center interest. So it's a free thought entity, and I've been admiring of it. But I've seen recently that the people in Quillette themselves are very self-conscious that they might become their own echo chamber. And they don't want to do that. So if you are, by design, let's say, anti-political correctness group, there's a risk that you'll become your enemy. To their credit, they are alert to that, and they don't want to be that.
Yeah, I know you've got to run in just a second, but I've got kind of two quick questions on your career and what you've learned from it. I guess if you were starting your career all over again, imagine that kind of everything that you know now, but you're in your 18-year-old self's body, kind of finishing high school in 2019. What do you think your plan for having a social impact ought to be?
Not to have a plan for having a social impact ought to be your plan for having a social impact. So I think if someone says, I'm going to have a social impact, that's actually self-defeating. It's a little like saying, I'm going to try to get to sleep. That's not a good way to try to get to sleep. To care about something. Myself, in terms of my career, I've not focused on having a social impact. If I've been lucky enough to, it's been a byproduct of pursuing interests. So my wife, was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and really has had a social impact. Her advice for having a social impact, I think I would embrace, which is know something about something. And I think I would tell my younger self, you're going to be more lucky than you could possibly have imagined. And forget whether I said that. Now go ahead, live your life. But I'd say do what you love.
Is the reason for that it's kind of more motivating and that you like throw yourself into it in a bigger way? Or perhaps do people have good instincts about kind of what interests them does line up with impact?
Well, I think if you try to have a social impact, you don't have anything yet that you want to have a social impact with. So if you care, let's say, about highway safety, then if you want to have a social impact with respect to highway safety, the first thing is to learn everything there is to know about highway safety. And I guess the second thing is to say something that's relevant and helpful to people about highway safety, or to do something with respect to highway safety.
Do you think once you're an expert and kind of in the middle of your career, that kind of thinking about, what steps can I take to have a social impact now to fix this problem is more sensible than when you're just a kid?
I may have an idiosyncratic answer to this, because I've never thought, how do I have a social impact? Not once has that occurred to me. I have thought, I guess, how do I make my writing clear? And when I was offered a position in the government, I was aware that if I didn't screw up, I could have an impact. And that was not uninteresting. That was, thrilling. And if someone asks me to help with something that has a social impact, I'm completely honored. But to think, how can I have a social impact? It feels a little too abstract. Right? If it's, how can I help reduce highway deaths? Or what can I do about the opioid crisis? That's the opioid crisis, by the way, unlike the replication crisis, that's a crisis. People are dying. So I think I would focus on the issue that concerns you. And to have a social impact, Hitler had a massive social impact.
I should have said positive, maybe. Yeah, how have your years in government affected your academic work, if at all?
Thank you for asking. I think by anchoring me in practical things more, and in a way that's not ideal. So I think academics often do best if they let their minds go, to all sorts of places. I had a good friend in government who told me after 2 years, this is a very good academic and a very good public servant, who said, "Get out." And he said, "Government ruined me. I can't think academically anymore, and it's going to ruin you. Get out." And I stayed a little while longer than he wanted, but I never forgot his words.
That's interesting. You think that the mindset's just too different?
Yes. So there are many academics. This is, I think, a pretty interesting subject. Many academics I saw go into the Obama government who were terrible at it, because they were really good at coming up with creative ideas, but the idea either couldn't or shouldn't be implemented. And they weren't good at doing the solid work of turning a good policy into reality. And so I tried early on to have my ears big and my mouth small, so that I would just learn from people who knew how to do government. So the people in government often, whom I greatly admired, they wouldn't be good academics. They're not writers, and they're not idea people. They're amazing at figuring out how to pull levers to do something which actually is helpful. It's a really different skill set.
Well, I really appreciate you finding a full hour. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but you're such a prolific author. There's probably a good chance we'll have another book to discuss with you maybe in a couple of years' time.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Fabulous questions.
Yeah. My guest today has been Cass Sunstein. Thanks for coming on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Cass.
Thank you.
The blog post for this episode will link to the papers and books that came up in the discussion. And the show notes will also take you to our annual review and information on how you can support 80,000 Hours if you think our work is having a lot of impact. The 80,000 Hours podcast is produced by Kieran Harris. Thanks for joining. Talk to you in a week or two.